Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're exploring the world of Roman gladiators, where Hollywood has convinced us that being a professional arena fighter was like ancient mixed martial arts, when the reality was more like being livestock bred for public slaughter. Before we enter the arena of historical misery, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy falling asleep to tales of historical suffering, and subscribe only if you genuinely want more content about why the past was terrible even for people who supposedly lived glamorous lives. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining me for these midnight tours through humanity's greatest hits of exploitation. Now settle in, maybe grab a snack that wasn't rationed by people who wanted to keep you just healthy enough to die entertaining strangers, and let's explore why being a gladiator was less like being a professional athlete and more like being a condemned prisoner with better marketing. Chapter 1: The School of Death, Gladiator Training Hell. Gladiator schools were essentially prison camps where human beings were transformed into killing machines for public entertainment. These weren't athletic academies, they were systematic dehumanization facilities designed to break men's spirits while teaching them to kill each other efficiently and spectacularly. Recruitment into gladiator schools came primarily through slavery, criminal conviction, and debt bondage rather than voluntary enlistment. Most gladiators were prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or people who had been sold into slavery, making gladiator training a punishment rather than a career choice. Living conditions in gladiator schools resembled military prisons more than athletic facilities, with trainees housed in small cells, fed minimal rations, and subjected to constant surveillance by guards who viewed them as valuable but dangerous property that could escape or rebel if not properly controlled. Training regimens were designed to maximize entertainment value rather than fighter welfare, with gladiators learning theatrical combat techniques that prioritized spectacle over survival. Trainers cared more about creating dramatic fights than keeping gladiators alive, since dead gladiators could be easily replaced. Weapon specialization forced gladiators to master specific fighting styles that left them vulnerable to opponents trained in different techniques, creating artificial disadvantages that made fights more unpredictable and exciting for audiences who bet on the outcomes. Medical care was provided only to the extent necessary to keep gladiators functional for arena combat, with injuries treated using crude techniques that left fighters permanently damaged but still capable of entertaining crowds. Gladiator medicine prioritized short-term functionality over long-term health. Psychological conditioning involved systematic brutalization designed to make gladiators comfortable with killing and dying for public entertainment. This conditioning broke down normal human inhibitions against violence while creating men who were dangerous to everyone around them, including themselves. Dietary control was used to manage gladiator health and appearance, with specific foods prescribed to build muscle mass while maintaining the physical appearance that audiences expected. Gladiators were fed like livestock being prepared for slaughter rather than athletes being prepared for competition. Social isolation from normal Roman society ensured that gladiators remained psychologically dependent on their trainers and owners while preventing them from developing relationships that might interfere with their willingness to fight and die for entertainment. Discipline in gladiator schools was enforced through violence, with trainees beaten, tortured, or killed for infractions that would merit minor punishments in other contexts. The threat of immediate death hung over every aspect of gladiator training, making compliance the only survival strategy. Economic exploitation meant that gladiators generated enormous profits for their owners while receiving minimal compensation for risking their lives. The gladiator business model was based on extracting maximum entertainment value from human suffering while providing minimum investment in gladiator welfare. Escape prevention involved physical restraints, constant surveillance, and brutal punishment for attempted flight, creating prison conditions that made gladiator schools into human warehouses where escape meant certain death and compliance meant probable death. Chapter 2: Arena Combat, Choreographed Murder. Gladiator fights were not fair contests between equally matched opponents but carefully orchestrated spectacles designed to provide maximum entertainment value through systematic exploitation of human desperation and suffering. These weren't sporting events, they were public executions disguised as athletic competitions. Fight arrangements were manipulated by promoters who paired gladiators based on entertainment value rather than fair competition, often matching inexperienced fighters against veterans or creating scenarios where one fighter had significant advantages over another to create predictable but exciting outcomes. Crowd psychology played a major role in determining fight outcomes, with audiences expecting certain types of violence and drama that influenced how fights were conducted and concluded. Gladiators fought not just against each other but against audience expectations that demanded blood and death. Weapon inequality was built into many gladiator matchups, with different fighter types using weapons and armor combinations that created artificial advantages and disadvantages. This asymmetry made fights more unpredictable and exciting but also more unfair and dangerous for the disadvantaged fighters. Injury rates were extremely high because gladiator combat was designed to cause spectacular wounds that would entertain audiences rather than determine winners through skill alone. Gladiators regularly suffered severe injuries that ended their careers or killed them outright during individual fights. Death rates varied depending on the type of games and the political climate, but mortality was always significant because audiences expected to see deaths during gladiator exhibitions. Gladiators knew that survival depended as much on crowd approval as on fighting skill. Medical treatment during fights was minimal and primarily focused on stopping bleeding long enough to continue entertainment rather than providing adequate care for serious injuries. Arena physicians were more like veterinarians treating valuable animals than doctors caring for human patients. Referee corruption influenced fight outcomes through biased officiating that favored certain fighters or created dramatic moments that enhanced entertainment value. Gladiator contests were closer to professional wrestling than legitimate athletic competitions in terms of predetermined outcomes and theatrical elements. Post-fight procedures included immediate disposal of dead gladiators and minimal care for survivors, with wounded fighters often dying from infections or inadequate medical treatment days or weeks after their arena appearances. Survival of the fight itself was no guarantee of long-term survival. Psychological warfare between gladiators included intimidation tactics, trash talking, and attempts to demoralize opponents before and during fights. This mental combat added another layer of cruelty to contests that were already physically and emotionally devastating. Seasonal scheduling of gladiator games created periods of intense activity followed by relative inactivity, but this schedule served the convenience of promoters and audiences rather than the training needs or health requirements of the fighters themselves. Equipment maintenance was the responsibility of gladiator schools and owners who had financial incentives to minimize costs while maximizing spectacle, often resulting in inferior weapons and armor that increased danger for fighters while reducing expenses for promoters. Chapter 3: The Economics of Human Blood Sports. The gladiator industry was a massive commercial enterprise built on the systematic exploitation of human suffering for profit. Understanding the economics reveals how financial incentives created systems that prioritized entertainment value over human life while enriching promoters and owners at the expense of the fighters who provided the actual entertainment. Investment costs for establishing gladiator schools included purchasing slaves, building training facilities, hiring trainers, and acquiring weapons and equipment. These upfront expenses were substantial but could be recouped through rental fees, prize money, and betting commissions if gladiators survived long enough to become profitable. Revenue streams from gladiator entertainment included ticket sales, concession profits, betting commissions, and rental fees for lending gladiators to other promoters. The most successful gladiators generated multiple income sources for their owners while receiving minimal compensation for their services. Pricing structures for gladiator exhibitions varied based on fighter quality, event importance, and audience expectations, with the most popular gladiators commanding higher fees but also facing greater pressure to provide spectacular performances that often resulted in serious injuries or death. Insurance systems didn't exist for gladiator owners, but risk management involved maintaining stable of fighters so that individual deaths or injuries wouldn't destroy the entire business. This led to deliberate overproduction of gladiators who were treated as replaceable assets rather than valuable individuals. Betting markets created additional profit opportunities for people connected to gladiator schools who had inside information about fighter conditions, training progress, and planned fight outcomes. Gambling on gladiator contests was legalized corruption that enriched insiders while cheating ordinary spectators. Sponsorship deals with wealthy Romans provided funding for elaborate games in exchange for social prestige and political influence, creating systems where gladiator suffering served the career advancement of politicians and social climbers who gained popularity through providing bloody entertainment. Labor costs were minimized through slavery and debt bondage, with most gladiators receiving only basic food, shelter, and medical care rather than wages that would reflect the revenue they generated. The gladiator labor model was based on systematic wage theft disguised as slavery. Marketing expenses for promoting gladiator games included public announcements, decorations, and publicity campaigns designed to maximize attendance and betting activity. More money was often spent on advertising gladiator contests than on caring for the gladiators themselves. Equipment expenses were significant but were treated as business investments rather than safety measures, with owners purchasing weapons and armor that would create entertaining fights rather than protect fighter welfare. Gladiator equipment was designed for spectacle rather than protection. Medical expenses were minimized through use of primitive treatments and quick disposal of gladiators who couldn't be economically repaired. Gladiator healthcare was veterinary medicine focused on maintaining functionality rather than providing comprehensive medical care. Profit margins in the gladiator industry were substantial for successful promoters but came entirely from extracting value from human suffering while providing minimal compensation to the people who generated the entertainment. Gladiator economics were fundamentally exploitative and designed to enrich everyone except the fighters. Market competition between gladiator schools and promoters led to escalating violence and spectacle as businesses tried to outdo each other in providing extreme entertainment. This competition created pressure for ever more dangerous contests that increased mortality rates among gladiators. Chapter 4: Life Expectancy and Death Statistics. The statistical reality of gladiator mortality reveals the true nature of arena combat as a form of systematic execution disguised as entertainment. These weren't career athletes with long professional lives but condemned men whose survival was measured in fights rather than years. Average career length for gladiators was extremely short, with most fighters dying within their first few arena appearances. Even successful gladiators rarely survived more than a few years of active competition, making gladiator careers more like extended execution processes than sustainable professional activities. Survival rates varied by gladiator type, with heavily armored fighters having slightly better chances than lightly equipped opponents, but even the most protected gladiators faced mortality rates that would be considered unacceptable in any other context. No gladiator category had genuinely good survival odds. Injury accumulation was inevitable for gladiators who survived multiple fights, with successful fighters becoming progressively more damaged and vulnerable over time. Long-term survival often depended more on avoiding serious injury than on developing superior fighting skills. Age factors significantly influenced gladiator mortality, with older fighters facing declining physical capabilities while younger fighters lacked experience necessary for survival. The optimal age range for gladiator survival was narrow and brief, making most fighters too young or too old for their profession. Training fatalities occurred regularly during preparation for arena combat, with gladiators dying from practice injuries, training accidents, and deliberate violence used to maintain discipline. Some gladiators died before ever reaching the arena, killed during the preparation process. Medical mortality resulted from inadequate treatment of combat injuries, with many gladiators dying from infections, internal bleeding, and complications that could have been prevented with proper medical care. Gladiator medicine was so primitive that minor injuries often became fatal. Suicide rates among gladiators were significant, with fighters taking their own lives rather than continuing to face almost certain death in arena combat. Some gladiators viewed suicide as their only escape from systematic exploitation and inevitable execution. Execution rates for defeated gladiators varied depending on crowd mood, political climate, and entertainment value, but death was always a possible outcome for any gladiator fight. Even victorious gladiators could be killed if audiences demanded additional bloodshed. Retirement opportunities for gladiators were rare and usually involved fighters who had become too popular to kill but too damaged to continue fighting effectively. Most gladiators who survived long enough to retire were physically and psychologically destroyed by their experiences. Record-keeping of gladiator mortality was incomplete because fighters were considered property rather than people, making it difficult to determine exact death rates. However, available evidence suggests that gladiator combat was among the most deadly occupations in human history. Comparative mortality rates show that gladiators died more frequently than soldiers in active combat, workers in the most dangerous industries, and even condemned criminals facing execution. Being a gladiator was statistically more dangerous than almost any other human activity. Demographic impact of gladiator mortality affected entire populations as young men were systematically killed for entertainment, removing productive individuals from society while providing no compensating benefits except momentary amusement for audiences who viewed human death as entertainment. Chapter 5: The Brutal Reality of Arena Medicine. Medical care for gladiators was primitive, painful, and primarily focused on keeping fighters functional for future combat rather than promoting actual health and recovery. Gladiator medicine was veterinary care applied to human beings who were valued only for their entertainment potential. Wound treatment in gladiator schools involved crude techniques like cauterization with hot irons, which stopped bleeding but caused additional tissue damage and excruciating pain. This treatment often left gladiators with permanent disabilities and chronic pain that made future fighting even more difficult and dangerous. Surgical procedures performed on gladiators were limited to basic operations that could be completed quickly with minimal equipment, often without any form of anesthesia or pain management. Gladiators underwent amputations, tumor removals, and other surgeries while fully conscious and in agony. Pain management was essentially non-existent, with gladiators expected to endure severe pain without complaint or assistance. The Roman medical system had limited understanding of pain relief and even less interest in providing comfort to people who were considered expendable entertainment assets. Infection control was primitive at best, with wounds often becoming infected due to dirty instruments, contaminated dressings, and unsanitary conditions in gladiator schools. Many gladiators died from secondary infections rather than their original combat injuries. Rehabilitation services were non-existent because gladiators were expected to return to combat as quickly as possible regardless of their physical condition. There was no physical therapy, occupational therapy, or other recovery services that might help gladiators heal properly from their injuries. Dental care was limited to tooth extraction when dental problems became too painful to ignore, with no preventive care or restorative treatments available. Gladiators often fought with severe dental problems that affected their ability to eat, speak, and concentrate during combat. Mental health treatment didn't exist because psychological problems weren't recognized as legitimate medical conditions. Gladiators suffering from what we would now recognize as PTSD, depression, or anxiety disorders received no treatment and were expected to continue fighting regardless of their mental state. Nutritional medicine was focused on maintaining body weight and muscle mass rather than promoting overall health, with gladiators fed specific diets designed to create the physical appearance that audiences expected rather than to optimize health and recovery from injuries. Emergency medical care during arena combat was limited to basic first aid designed to keep fights entertaining rather than to save gladiators' lives. Arena physicians were more concerned with maintaining spectacle than with providing effective medical treatment. Drug availability was limited to basic herbal remedies and alcohol, with no effective medications for treating pain, infection, or other medical problems. Gladiators often suffered from conditions that could have been easily treated with modern medications but were untreatable with ancient medical technology. Medical experimentation sometimes occurred on gladiators who were used as test subjects for new treatments or surgical techniques, with their consent neither sought nor required. Some gladiators were subjected to medical procedures that were performed for research purposes rather than therapeutic benefit. Chapter 6: The Social Status Paradox. Gladiators occupied a unique and contradictory position in Roman society, simultaneously despised as slaves and criminals while also celebrated as entertainment celebrities. This social paradox created psychological pressures that were almost as damaging as the physical dangers of arena combat. Legal status of gladiators was that of slaves or condemned criminals, meaning they had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's discretion. Even popular gladiators remained property rather than people in the eyes of Roman law, making their celebrity status meaningless in practical terms. Social stigma attached to gladiators was severe, with Roman society viewing arena fighters as the lowest form of human beings who had forfeited their dignity through participation in public violence. Gladiators were social outcasts who were excluded from normal Roman society even when they achieved fame. Celebrity worship of successful gladiators created a bizarre situation where the same people who despised gladiators as social inferiors also idolized them as entertainment heroes. This contradiction created psychological pressures for gladiators who were simultaneously worshipped and despised by the same audiences. Sexual exploitation of gladiators was common, with both male and female fighters being used as sexual entertainment for wealthy Romans who viewed them as exotic and dangerous sexual partners. Gladiator sexuality was commodified and exploited just like their fighting abilities. Family relationships were complicated by gladiator status, with fighters often separated from their families and prevented from forming normal romantic relationships. Children of gladiators inherited their parents' social stigma and often faced discrimination throughout their lives. Economic limitations prevented gladiators from accumulating wealth or property even when they became successful entertainers. Most gladiator earnings went to their owners, leaving fighters with minimal resources despite generating substantial profits for others. Religious restrictions sometimes applied to gladiators who were considered ritually unclean due to their association with death and violence. Some religious ceremonies and social functions excluded gladiators, further isolating them from normal Roman society. Political powerlessness was total for gladiators who had no voice in government and no legal recourse against abuse or exploitation. Even the most famous gladiators remained politically invisible and vulnerable to arbitrary punishment or execution by Roman authorities. Social mobility was extremely limited for gladiators, with freedom being the best possible outcome but one that was rarely achieved. Most gladiators died in slavery, and those who gained freedom often remained socially marginalized due to their gladiator background. Psychological impact of this social contradiction was severe, with gladiators struggling to understand their place in a society that simultaneously celebrated and despised them. This cognitive dissonance contributed to mental health problems that were never recognized or treated. Cultural influence of gladiators was significant despite their low social status, with gladiator imagery, language, and culture affecting broader Roman society. However, this cultural influence didn't translate into improved social status or better treatment for actual gladiators. Historical legacy of gladiators has been romanticized in modern popular culture, but contemporary Roman sources reveal the deep social prejudice and systematic exploitation that characterized gladiator life. The reality was far different from modern romanticized portrayals. Chapter 7: The Diet of the Damned: What Gladiators Actually Ate. The gladiator diet wasn't the protein-rich feast of champions that modern audiences might imagine, but a carefully calculated starvation regimen designed to maintain muscle mass while keeping fighters dependent, controllable, and ultimately expendable. Understanding what gladiators ate reveals how their owners viewed them as livestock rather than athletes. Barley was the primary staple of the gladiator diet, earning fighters the derogatory nickname horderii or barley eaters. This grain was cheap, filling, and provided basic energy, but it was also the same food fed to horses and other work animals, reinforcing the gladiators' status as beasts rather than men. Protein sources were limited and carefully rationed, with gladiators receiving small portions of meat, usually the cheapest cuts available or scraps from wealthier Romans' meals. The protein gladiators consumed was often spoiled, poorly cooked, or contaminated, leading to frequent illness and digestive problems. Vegetable intake consisted primarily of beans, lentils, and cheap root vegetables that provided bulk without nutrition. These foods were filling but lacked the vitamins and minerals necessary for optimal health, leaving gladiators chronically malnourished despite appearing physically imposing. Water quality in gladiator schools was poor, with fighters often drinking from contaminated sources that spread disease throughout the barracks. Clean water was expensive and reserved for more valuable uses than keeping gladiators healthy, leading to frequent outbreaks of waterborne illnesses. Meal timing was irregular and depended on training schedules and owner convenience rather than gladiator nutritional needs. Fighters often went long periods without food, then received large meals that caused digestive distress and interfered with training and combat performance. Food preparation was minimal and unsanitary, with gladiator meals cooked in large batches using dirty utensils and contaminated ingredients. The same cooks who prepared animal feed often prepared gladiator food, using similar methods and showing similar concern for food safety. Dietary supplements were unknown, leaving gladiators deficient in essential nutrients that affected their strength, healing ability, and mental function. Modern understanding of nutrition shows that gladiator diets were inadequate for supporting the physical demands of their training and combat. Hunger as control was deliberately used by gladiator owners who understood that hungry men were more desperate and compliant than well-fed ones. Starvation was a management tool that kept gladiators focused on survival rather than rebellion or escape. Special occasion feasts were occasionally provided before major games, but but these were propaganda exercises designed to create the illusion of good treatment rather than genuine attempts to improve gladiator nutrition. These meals were often too rich for fighters accustomed to poor diets, causing illness rather than benefit. Food as reward and punishment created hierarchies among gladiators, with successful fighters receiving slightly better rations while failures were given even less food. This system encouraged competition and prevented solidarity among fighters who might otherwise unite against their oppressors. Medical dietary treatment was non-existent, with injured or sick gladiators receiving the same inadequate food as healthy ones. There was no understanding of how diet affected healing or recovery, leading to prolonged illness and permanent damage from treatable conditions. Chapter 8: Women in the Arena, Double Exploitation. Female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, faced all the horrors of male gladiators while enduring additional exploitation based on their gender. These women were subjected to systematic sexual abuse, social degradation, and unique forms of cruelty that made their already terrible lives even worse. Recruitment of female gladiators followed similar patterns to male fighters, with most women forced into combat through slavery, criminal conviction, or desperate poverty. However, some upper-class Roman women voluntarily entered the arena, seeking excitement or rebelling against social restrictions, only to discover that gladiator life was hell regardless of one's background. Training for female gladiators was identical to male preparation in its brutality and dehumanization, but women faced additional challenges including sexual harassment and assault from trainers, guards, and other gladiators. The gladiator school environment was designed for male prisoners, making it even more dangerous and degrading for women. Combat styles for gladiatrices often emphasized entertainment value over fighting effectiveness, with women forced to fight in revealing costumes that prioritized sexual appeal over protection. Female gladiator equipment was designed to titillate audiences rather than provide adequate defense against weapons. Sexual exploitation of female gladiators was systematic and unavoidable, with women used as prostitutes in addition to their fighting duties. Gladiatrices had no control over their sexual lives and were forced to provide entertainment both in the arena and in private encounters with wealthy Romans. Social stigma attached to female gladiators was even more severe than that faced by male fighters, as Roman society viewed women who participated in public violence as having abandoned all feminine virtue. Female gladiators were considered the lowest form of humanity, beneath even male slaves and criminals. Medical care for female gladiators ignored gender-specific health needs, with women receiving the same crude medical treatment as men despite having different physiological requirements. Female reproductive health was completely ignored, with pregnant gladiatrices forced to fight or undergo dangerous abortions. Pregnancy among female gladiators was treated as an inconvenience to be eliminated rather than a natural condition requiring care and protection. Pregnant gladiatrices were often forced to undergo abortions using dangerous methods that frequently resulted in death or permanent injury. Childcare was impossible for female gladiators who gave birth, as newborns were immediately separated from their mothers and either killed, sold into slavery, or abandoned. Female gladiators were denied the basic human experience of caring for their own children. Retirement prospects for female gladiators were even more limited than those for men, as older women had less entertainment value and fewer opportunities for survival outside the arena. Most gladiatrices died in combat or from the accumulated effects of their brutal treatment. Performance expectations for female gladiators included not only fighting skill but also sexual attractiveness and theatrical presentation that male fighters didn't face. Women were judged on their appearance and sexual appeal as much as their combat abilities, adding additional pressure to their already impossible situation. Legal status of female gladiators was identical to that of male fighters. They were property with no rights or protections. However, Roman law provided even fewer protections for women than for men, making female gladiators completely vulnerable to any form of abuse or exploitation. Chapter 9: The Psychology of Survival, Mental Breakdown in the Arena. The psychological toll of gladiator life was as devastating as the physical damage, with fighters subjected to systematic trauma that broke down normal human psychology and created men and women who were dangerous to themselves and others. Understanding gladiator mental health reveals how systematic abuse creates psychological monsters. Trauma accumulation was inevitable for gladiators who witnessed constant death and violence while facing their own mortality on a regular basis. Every fight, every training session, and every moment in gladiator school added to a growing psychological burden that eventually broke even the strongest minds. Sleep deprivation was chronic among gladiators who were kept awake by anxiety, pain from injuries, nightmares about past fights, and fears about future combat. The combination of physical stress and psychological terror made restful sleep impossible, leading to mental deterioration and poor decision-making. Social isolation destroyed normal human relationships and left gladiators emotionally dependent on their abusers while simultaneously resenting them. This psychological manipulation created confusion and despair that made escape or rebellion seem impossible even when opportunities arose. Identity confusion resulted from the contradiction between being simultaneously celebrated and despised by Roman society. Gladiators struggled to understand their place in a world that cheered for them while treating them as subhuman, leading to serious psychological problems that had no outlet or treatment. Survivor guilt affected gladiators who lived through fights that killed their opponents, especially when those opponents were friends or training partners. The psychological burden of killing people they cared about while knowing they might be next created unbearable emotional stress. Hypervigilance developed as gladiators learned that relaxation meant death, creating a constant state of alertness that was mentally exhausting and physically damaging. Gladiators could never feel safe or secure, even during rest periods between fights. Emotional numbing was a psychological defense mechanism that helped gladiators cope with constant trauma, but this numbness also prevented them from forming normal human relationships or experiencing positive emotions. Many gladiators became emotionally dead while still physically alive. Aggression problems developed as gladiators were trained to be violent while being prevented from expressing that violence except in approved contexts. This created men who were dangerous and unpredictable, prone to explosive violence that could be triggered by minor provocations. Depression was universal among gladiators who faced lives without hope, purpose, or the possibility of genuine happiness. The combination of physical suffering, social isolation, and constant fear created a mental state that modern psychology would recognize as severe clinical depression. Anxiety disorders affected every aspect of gladiator life, with fighters experiencing panic attacks, phobias, and generalized anxiety that interfered with their ability to function normally. The constant threat of death created a state of chronic anxiety that never abated. Substance abuse was limited by the controlled environment of gladiator schools, but fighters often used whatever alcohol or drugs they could obtain to numb their psychological pain. This self-medication provided temporary relief but added additional health problems to their already overwhelming burdens. Suicide attempts were common among gladiators who viewed death as preferable to continued suffering, but even suicide was difficult in the closely monitored environment of gladiator schools. Some fighters deliberately threw fights or provoked fatal injuries as forms of indirect suicide. Chapter 10: The Crowd's Bloodlust, Audience Participation in Murder. The Roman audience wasn't just passive observers of gladiator combat but active participants in systematic murder who influenced fight outcomes through their vocal demands for blood and death. Understanding crowd psychology reveals how ordinary people became complicit in mass murder disguised as entertainment. Crowd composition included all levels of Roman society, from slaves and freedmen in the upper seats to senators and emperors in the premium locations. This social mixing created a shared experience of bloodlust that transcended class boundaries while reinforcing the acceptability of gladiator exploitation. Audience expectations were carefully managed by promoters who understood that crowds demanded increasing levels of violence and spectacle to remain satisfied. Each gladiator game had to be more extreme than the last, creating an escalating cycle of violence that made survival increasingly impossible for fighters. Vocal participation by audiences directly influenced fight outcomes, with crowds shouting instructions, insults, and demands that fighters were expected to follow. Gladiators fought not just against their opponents but against crowd expectations that often demanded death regardless of fighting skill. Betting activity created financial incentives for specific fight outcomes, with wealthy Romans gambling enormous sums on gladiator contests. This betting created corruption and manipulation that affected how fights were conducted and concluded, often disadvantaging gladiators who were less popular with gamblers. Social pressure within the audience made it difficult for individuals to express sympathy for gladiators or opposition to the violence, as doing so would mark them as weak or unpatriotic. The crowd psychology created a situation where cruelty became a social expectation rather than a personal choice. Entertainment value was measured by the amount of blood spilled and the creativity of violence displayed, with audiences becoming bored by simple deaths and demanding increasingly elaborate and cruel methods of killing. This audience demand drove the escalation of gladiator combat into pure sadism. Political manipulation used gladiator games to distract Roman citizens from political problems while demonstrating the power and wealth of political leaders who sponsored the games. Gladiator blood became a tool for political control that kept the population entertained while being systematically exploited. Gender dynamics in the audience included women who were just as bloodthirsty as men, dispelling any myth that female spectators were more compassionate toward gladiators. Roman women actively participated in demanding gladiator deaths and showed no mercy toward female fighters. Child exposure to gladiator violence normalized extreme cruelty for young Romans who grew up viewing human death as entertainment. This childhood conditioning created adults who were capable of enjoying systematic murder without experiencing normal human empathy or moral qualms. Religious justification was sometimes used to make gladiator killing seem acceptable, with some Romans arguing that gladiator death served religious purposes or honored the gods. This religious cover allowed people to participate in murder while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. Psychological satisfaction derived from gladiator games included the pleasure of watching others suffer while remaining safe, the excitement of witnessing death without personal risk, and the social bonding that came from sharing violent experiences with other audience members. Long-term effects of regular gladiator attendance included psychological desensitization to violence, increased aggression in daily life, and the normalization of cruelty that affected how Romans treated slaves, criminals, and other vulnerable populations outside the arena. Chapter 11: Retirement and Freedom, the Myth of Gladiator Liberation. The few gladiators who survived long enough to potentially earn freedom discovered that retirement from the arena didn't mean escape from their gladiator identity or the psychological and physical damage that defined the rest of their lives. Freedom for gladiators was often just a different form of suffering. Freedom requirements were deliberately set at almost impossible levels, with gladiators needing to survive dozens of fights while maintaining crowd popularity and generating profits for their owners. Most fighters died long before accumulating enough victories or money to purchase their freedom. Wooden sword ceremony, where successful gladiators received the rudes as a symbol of freedom, was rare and often came too late to matter. By the time gladiators earned freedom, they were usually too damaged physically and psychologically to enjoy or benefit from their liberation. Financial reality for freed gladiators was harsh, as most had no money, property, or marketable skills outside of violence. Freedom without resources meant poverty, homelessness, and continued dependence on former owners or gladiator schools for basic survival. Physical disabilities accumulated during gladiator careers made normal employment impossible for most retired fighters, who suffered from chronic pain, permanent injuries, and physical limitations that prevented them from supporting themselves through conventional work. Social stigma followed gladiators even after freedom, with Roman society continuing to view former gladiators as degraded individuals who had forfeited their dignity through participation in arena combat. Freedom didn't restore social status or respectability. Employment opportunities for former gladiators were limited to jobs related to violence or entertainment, such as bodyguard work, training new gladiators, or performing in less prestigious combat exhibitions. Most freed gladiators remained trapped in the same violent world that had destroyed their health. Psychological problems persisted after retirement, with former gladiators suffering from what modern psychology would recognize as severe PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and other mental health conditions. There was no treatment available for these problems in ancient Rome. Family relationships were difficult or impossible for former gladiators who had been separated from their families for years or decades while suffering trauma that made normal emotional connections challenging. Many freed gladiators died alone and forgotten. Legal vulnerabilities remained even after freedom, as former gladiators had limited legal rights and could be easily victimized by more powerful Romans who faced no consequences for abusing or exploiting ex-gladiators. Freedom didn't provide genuine legal protection. Economic exploitation continued in new forms, with freed gladiators often forced to work for former owners or gladiator schools under contracts that were barely better than slavery. Many discovered that freedom was just a different form of bondage. Health deterioration accelerated after retirement as former gladiators no longer received even the minimal medical care provided to active fighters. Many died within years of gaining freedom due to untreated injuries and accumulated health problems from their gladiator careers. Historical records of retired gladiators are sparse because most died in poverty and obscurity, forgotten by the same society that had once cheered their performances. The few who left historical traces were exceptions rather than representative examples of gladiator retirement experiences. The ultimate lesson of gladiator history is that systematic dehumanization can make any level of cruelty seem acceptable when it serves the entertainment or economic interests of powerful groups. The gladiator system was a machine for converting human beings into disposable entertainment products. Sleep well tonight, knowing that tomorrow you won't be forced to fight to the death for strangers' entertainment. You won't be owned as property by people who view you as a disposable asset, and your medical care won't consist of having wounds cauterized with hot irons while you're fully conscious. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of Roman entertainment culture. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this examination of how systematic exploitation can be disguised as glorious entertainment. And let me know in the comments what other romanticized historical institutions you'd like me to examine with similar honesty. Until next time, stay grateful for human rights and remember, gladiator combat was hell for the people who were forced to participate in it, regardless of how exciting it might seem in movies and television.